In the frozen dawn of December 16, 1944, the forests of the Ardennes erupted in fire. For months, the Western Front had settled into what many Allied commanders believed was a slow, grinding advance toward the Rhine. The German army, battered after Normandy and the loss of France, seemed to be in retreat everywhere. Then, without warning, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks struck through a sector the Allies considered quiet. It was Adolf Hitler's last great gamble of the war, an offensive he believed could split the British and American armies, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. The plan was bold to the point of desperation. By punching through the thinly held Ardennes, German armored columns would race westward to the Meuse River, cross it, and drive all the way to the Belgian port of Antwerp. If successful, the Allied front would be cut in half, supply lines would collapse, political unity between London and Washington might fracture. Hitler called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was designed not merely to delay defeat, but to reverse it. At the spearhead of this offensive stood the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Obersturmbannführer Sepp Dietrich. Once a close bodyguard of Hitler, Dietrich now commanded some of Germany's most formidable armored formations, including elite Waffen-SS divisions such as the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. These units were experienced, heavily equipped, and fueled by ideological conviction. They were told this attack would change the course of the war. Before dawn, a massive artillery barrage shattered the American lines. In places, inexperienced U.S. divisions, many of them recently arrived and resting after previous campaigns, were caught off guard. Communications were cut. Forward units were overwhelmed. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft, removing one of the Americans' greatest advantages, air superiority. German assault teams infiltrated behind the lines, spreading confusion and severing roads. Within days, German armored columns had advanced nearly 60 kilometers into Allied territory. Road signs were flipped. American fuel depots were captured. Entire units found themselves encircled or forced into chaotic retreats. The attack tore a massive bulge into the Allied front lines, so large it would give the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. In the opening phase, the shock was profound. American commanders struggled to grasp the scale of the assault. Reports from the front were contradictory and alarming. Some officers believed they were facing local counterattacks. Others feared a full-scale breakthrough. German units disguised in American uniforms created further panic, spreading rumors and sabotaging communications. Military police began stopping vehicles to ask soldiers baseball trivia questions to verify their identity. At the center of this unfolding crisis lay a small Belgian crossroads town, Bastogne. It was not large, but it was vital. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of reinforcements and supplies across the southern sector of the Bulge. German planners understood this. So did the Americans. As the German advance accelerated, Bastogne became a focal point. American units, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, were rushed into the town to hold it at all costs. They arrived in freezing conditions, often without full winter gear. Snow blanketed the forests, temperatures plunged below freezing. The defenders dug foxholes into frozen ground as German armored columns tightened the noose. By December 20th, Bastogne was effectively surrounded. German forces had cut the main roads. Artillery began to pound the perimeter. Inside the town, ammunition and medical supplies ran low. The wounded filled makeshift aid stations. Clouds and snow continued to shield the German advance from Allied aircraft. It was during these early days that confidence surged within the German high command. The offensive appeared to be working. American lines had been ruptured. Large formations were retreating or reorganizing under pressure. The Reich's propaganda machine proclaimed a coming victory in the West. According to accounts from captured communications and post-war testimony, some German officers expressed open contempt for their opponents. The stereotype of Americans as materialistic and soft, merchants not soldiers, circulated within certain SS circles. The rapid breakthrough seemed to confirm their belief. After all, German armored units had smashed through 4 American divisions in a matter of days. To the attackers, it felt like 1940 all over again, a lightning strike through difficult terrain, confusion in enemy ranks, momentum unstoppable. Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army pushed hard towards its objectives, though not without difficulty. Traffic jams clogged narrow Ardennes roads, fuel shortages began to bite, bridges became choke points. Yet, from the German perspective, the essential fact remained. They had achieved surprise, they had broken through. The initiative, for the first time in months, belonged to them. But beneath the surface of triumph, cracks were already forming. The timetable was slipping. Resistance in certain sectors stiffened unexpectedly. American engineers destroyed key bridges. Small groups of U.S. soldiers held crossroads longer than anticipated, delaying entire armored columns. Every hour lost mattered. Still, in those first critical days, the momentum felt undeniable. Bastogne was encircled. The Bulge deepened. Allied commanders scrambled to contain the crisis. On maps in German headquarters, arrows pointed confidently westward toward the Meuse. It was the last great offensive of the Third Reich, a gamble fueled by dwindling reserves and fading time. For a brief moment in December 1944, it seemed as though Hitler's audacious stroke might succeed. The forests of the Ardennes echoed with the rumble of panzers, and in the cold winter air hung a dangerous certainty. The Americans were broken, and the road to Antwerp lay open. What neither side fully understood yet was that this apparent triumph rested on a razor's edge. The siege of Bastogne was tightening. German armor was advancing. Confidence bordered on arrogance. But the deeper the spearhead drove into Allied lines, the more exposed its flanks became. The sneer that Americans were merely merchants, not soldiers, would soon be tested in fire and ice.
On December 22, 1944, the situation on the Western Front was critical. The German offensive in the Ardennes had torn a massive gap in Allied lines, and Bastogne was surrounded. The speed and scale of the attack had stunned commanders who only weeks earlier believed Germany was collapsing. Now, maps in headquarters rooms from Versailles to Luxembourg showed a deep and dangerous penetration. If the German spearhead reached the Meuse River, the consequences could be catastrophic. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a decision that would define the winter campaign. Reinforcements were limited. Weather had grounded much of the Allied Air Force. Communications were strained. The immediate question was simple but terrifying: how to stop the advance before it split the Allied front in two. The key lay to the south. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was at that moment engaged in offensive operations in eastern France. His forces were driving toward the Saar, pressing into German defenses. To redirect such a massive formation in the middle of combat was not just difficult, it was almost unthinkable. Entire supply chains would have to pivot. Artillery, fuel, ammunition, medical units, engineers, everything would need to turn north through winter roads already clogged with retreating units and civilian refugees. Yet Patton had anticipated the possibility of a German counterstroke. His intelligence staff had warned that the Ardennes, lightly held and difficult terrain, was vulnerable. Days before the German attack, Third Army planners had quietly prepared contingency options for a rapid change of direction. 3 separate operational plans had been drafted, each outlining a potential pivot north if required. On December 19, at a tense conference in Verdun, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders. The room was heavy with uncertainty. German forces were still advancing. Reports from Bastogne were grim. Eisenhower asked each commander what could be done. When it was Patton's turn, he stunned the room. He stated that he could disengage from his current offensive, pivot his entire army 90 degrees, and launch a counterattack toward Bastogne within 48 hours. Many present were skeptical. Such a maneuver involved moving over 100,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles across icy terrain in the middle of winter. It required halting one offensive and beginning another in a completely different direction. It demanded coordination at a scale rarely attempted under active enemy pressure. Eisenhower pressed him. Was it truly possible? Patton insisted it was. His staff had already prepared for it. The meeting ended with a decision. The Third Army would turn north and strike toward Bastogne to relieve the encircled garrison. The order went out almost immediately. Units already in contact with German forces had to disengage. Convoys were rerouted. Engineers were sent ahead to assess bridges and roads. Traffic control units worked around the clock to prevent gridlock. Snow and ice turned roads into hazards. Vehicles skidded. Columns stretched for miles through narrow forest routes. The scale of the maneuver was enormous. Approximately 133,000 soldiers would ultimately be involved in the counteroffensive. Thousands of trucks carried fuel and ammunition. Heavy artillery pieces had to be repositioned and recalibrated. Communications networks were re-established facing a new axis of advance. Maps were redrawn. Commanders briefed their men in freezing assembly areas lit by dim headlights and lanterns. All of this happened under constant pressure. German forces continued to press westward. Bastogne remained encircled. Inside the town, American defenders faced artillery bombardment and dwindling supplies. On December 22, German envoys delivered a demand for surrender to the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His reply was brief and defiant: "Nuts." The message traveled quickly through Allied ranks, becoming a symbol of resistance. But defiance alone would not break the encirclement. Relief had to arrive. Patton drove his staff relentlessly. He believed speed was decisive. Every hour mattered. Weather reports became critical. Clear skies would allow Allied aircraft to resume operations, disrupting German supply lines. Until then, ground forces would have to fight through. Skepticism lingered in some quarters of Allied command. Could an army truly pivot 90 degrees in winter and attack within 48 hours? Historically, such redeployments took far longer, even in favorable conditions. Yet on December 23, elements of the Third Army began their northern assault. The lead formations included the 4th Armored Division, tasked with punching through German defenses and reaching Bastogne. Their objective was not symbolic, it was operationally essential. Bastogne's road network was the hinge of the southern Bulge. If the Germans held it, their penetration could widen. If the Americans held it, the entire German advance risked being constricted and isolated. As the first units advanced, resistance stiffened. German forces had not expected such a rapid and massive response from the south. Intelligence estimates had assumed that American reserves were disorganized and scattered. Instead, armored columns now pushed forward through snow-covered villages and forested ridges, engaging in brutal, close combat. The transformation was dramatic. Only days earlier, the Germans dictated the tempo. Now they were forced to react to a powerful thrust threatening their exposed flank. The deeper their spearhead had driven west, the more vulnerable it became to counterattack from the south.
Eisenhower monitored developments closely. The success of the entire Allied position in the Ardennes depended on whether Patton's gamble would succeed. If the counterattack stalled, Bastogne might fall. If it broke through, the German offensive could lose its momentum. By December 24th, the Third Army was fully engaged. Progress was slow and costly. Snowdrifts, minefields, and determined German resistance delayed the advance. Casualties mounted, yet the movement did not stop. The promise of 48 hours was not rhetorical bravado, it was operational reality. Within that window, the Third Army had disengaged, reoriented, and attacked. It was one of the most rapid large-scale redeployments of the war. In German headquarters, confidence began to waver. Reports indicated significant American forces striking northward. The assumption that the Allies were paralyzed proved incorrect. Instead of collapsing, they were concentrating. The crisis meeting at Verdun had marked a turning point. What began as a German surprise offensive was evolving into a test of endurance and logistics. The initiative so confidently seized in the first days was now contested. The siege of Bastogne still held. German armor still occupied surrounding high ground. But from the south, through ice and fire, an American army was coming. The gamble in the Ardennes relied on speed, surprise, and the belief that the Allies would fracture under pressure. Instead, the pressure had triggered one of the most audacious countermaneuvers of the European war. The road to Bastogne was now a race, one that would decide whether the German breakthrough would become a decisive victory or the beginning of irreversible collapse.
By December 23, 1944, the impossible was already in motion. An entire American field army was turning in the snow. The U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, had been driving east toward Germany only days before. Now, under emergency orders, it was pivoting north in the middle of winter, an operation involving roughly 133,000 men, thousands of vehicles, heavy artillery, tank battalions, engineers, fuel convoys, and field hospitals. The maneuver required not just courage, but orchestration on a scale rarely attempted in modern warfare. The Ardennes was no open highway. It was a maze of narrow forest roads, steep ridgelines, frozen fields, and small stone villages. Snow and ice coated everything. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Engines struggled to start in the mornings, weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped burlap around boots for warmth. Fuel consumption soared as vehicles idled and traffic jams stretching for miles. Yet the orders were clear: move north, move fast, attack. Traffic control became as critical as combat. Military police stood at crossroads day and night, redirecting columns under blackout conditions. One wrong turn could trap an entire convoy behind stalled trucks or destroyed bridges. Engineers rushed ahead to reinforce crossings over icy streams. Recovery crews pulled tanks from ditches and coaxed frozen engines back to life. Artillery units faced a unique challenge. Heavy guns that had been calibrated for targets in the east now had to be repositioned and sighted in a completely different direction. Ammunition stocks were reshuffled, supply depots were relocated, communication lines had to be rewired across a shifting front. Despite the chaos, the movement unfolded with astonishing speed. Patton's staff had anticipated such a contingency. Alternative attack plans had been drafted even before the German offensive began. When the order came, it was not improvisation, it was execution. The spearhead of the counterattack was the 4th Armored Division, assigned the critical mission of breaking through to Bastogne. Its tanks and infantry would have to punch through German lines that were hardening by the hour. Every delay risked the fall of the surrounded garrison. German commanders initially underestimated the scale of what was happening to their south. Their intelligence suggested that American forces were still disorganized from the shock of the offensive. Instead, armored columns were now advancing toward the exposed flank of the German penetration. The deeper the German spearhead had pushed westward, the longer and thinner its supply lines had become. Fuel shortages were already emerging. Roads were congested with their own traffic. The weather, which had shielded the German advance in its early days, began to change. On December 23rd, skies gradually cleared. Allied aircraft returned in force. Fighter bombers struck German convoys, artillery positions, and fuel depots. What had once been a protective fog became a liability. The German columns visible against white snow were vulnerable from the air. On the ground, progress was brutal and slow. Villages such as Martelange, Bigonville, and Chaumont became scenes of close-quarters combat. German infantry fought stubbornly from stone houses and wooded high ground. Minefields littered approaches. Anti-tank guns lay concealed along narrow roads. The 4th Armored Division absorbed heavy casualties as it advanced. Tanks were knocked out in ambushes. Infantry units were pinned down by machine gun fire. Yet momentum, once built, did not falter. Reinforcements fed into the attack. Additional divisions of the Third Army followed, widening the assault corridor and securing the flanks. The pivot itself, nearly 90 degrees from eastward operations to a northward thrust, represented a fundamental shift in the battle's geometry. What had been a German offensive aimed west was now a vulnerable salient exposed on both sides. The Allied counterstroke threatened to pinch it from below. Inside Bastogne, the situation remained desperate. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were scarce. German artillery continued to bombard the perimeter. But the defenders held, tying down significant German forces that might otherwise have reinforced the main drive toward the Meuse. For German commanders, time was slipping away. The offensive had depended on rapid movement and the capture of Allied fuel supplies. Delays at key choke points, stubborn American resistance, and now the growing counterattack from the south were eroding that advantage. The ambitious timetable, reach the Meuse within days, was no longer realistic. Still, the fighting intensified. Snowstorms returned intermittently, complicating air operations and ground visibility. Soldiers on both sides endured freezing nights in foxholes. Frostbite cases mounted. Casualty evacuation was slow and dangerous over icy roads under artillery fire. By December 25th, Christmas Day, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were approaching the outer defensive ring around Bastogne. German resistance stiffened as they recognized the threat. Panzer units counterattacked, attempting to blunt the American thrust before it could reach the town. The clash was violent and confused. Tanks maneuvered at close range through wooded terrain. Infantry fought from hedgerows and frozen ditches. Artillery duels echoed through the valleys. Each mile gained came at a cost. Yet the broader reality was shifting. The German offensive was no longer a one-directional surge westward. It had become a struggle to hold what had already been taken. Instead of driving confidently towards Antwerp, German units were forced to divert resources to defend their flanks. The 90-degree pivot had transformed the battle. What had seemed only days earlier like a triumphant resurgence of blitzkrieg now faced a mounting logistical crisis. Fuel stocks dwindled. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Allied air power harassed every daylight movement. And from the south, the steady pressure of the Third Army did not relent. The race towards Bastogne was entering its decisive phase. The ring around the town still held, but it was under strain. German confidence, once buoyed by rapid gains and contemptuous assumptions about their enemy, began to erode in the face of organized resistance and relentless counterattack. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the momentum of war was shifting. The spear that had thrust deep into Allied lines was now being gripped from both sides. The pivot was complete. The counterstrike was underway. and the road to Bastogne was narrowing into a corridor of fire that would decide the fate of the entire offensive.
By December 25, 1944, Bastogne was a frozen island under fire. Encircled since December 20th, the town had endured constant artillery bombardment, probing attacks, and the steady pressure of tightening German lines. Inside the perimeter, roughly 18,000 American troops, primarily from the 101st Airborne Division, elements of the 10th Armored Division, and various support units, held defensive positions carved into snow and frozen earth. They lacked adequate winter clothing, ammunition was rationed carefully, medical supplies were stretched thin. Yet the crossroads town remained in American hands. Bastogne mattered because of geography. 7 major roads converged there, forming a hub in the southern sector of the German Bulge. For the German command, controlling it meant securing vital supply routes for continued advance. For the Americans, holding it meant denying the enemy freedom of movement and buying time for reinforcements to strike. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag and demanded surrender, citing the hopelessness of the American position. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, responded with a single word: nuts. The defiance spread quickly through the ranks, but symbolic resistance would not be enough. The defenders were low on artillery shells, low on food, and surrounded by increasingly aggressive German forces. Outside the perimeter, the 6th SS Panzer Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army continued to press the offensive westward. Yet the failure to seize Bastogne outright had forced them to divert troops to contain it. Every battalion tied down around the town was one less available for the push toward the Meuse River. Meanwhile, from the south, the Third Army drove forward. The lead elements of the 4th Armored Division fought through heavy resistance in villages and wooded ridges south of Bastogne. German anti-tank guns were well positioned along narrow approaches. Mines and roadblocks slowed the advance. Armor losses mounted. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters at times, yet the direction never changed. On December 23rd, clearing skies allowed Allied aircraft to resume operations. C-247 transport planes flew low over Bastogne, dropping much-needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food. It was not enough to end the siege, but it stabilized the defenders. Fighter bombers roared overhead, striking German positions and supply columns. The battlefield dynamic shifted as air superiority returned. Still, the German ring held. By December 25th and 26th, the fighting reached a critical intensity. German units launched determined assaults against Bastogne's perimeter, hoping to break the defense before relief could arrive. At the same time, panzer formations attempted to block the northward thrust of Patton's forces. The collision was inevitable. On the afternoon of December 26, 1944, near the village of Bastogne, the breakthrough came. After intense fighting, a column from the 4th Armored Division pushed through German lines. One of its tanks reached the outskirts of Bastogne and made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The encirclement was not completely eliminated that day. The corridor was narrow and under fire. German artillery continued to target the approaches, but the psychological barrier had been shattered. Bastogne was no longer isolated. The ring had been broken. For the soldiers inside the town, the sight of friendly armor was confirmation that the gamble had worked. For the German command, it marked the beginning of the end of their operational momentum. The failure to capture Bastogne quickly had already cost valuable time. Now, instead of tightening the noose, they were forced into defensive reactions. The broader strategic picture was deteriorating for Germany. Fuel shortages were becoming critical. The rapid advance of the early days had consumed precious reserves. Allied air power intensified its attacks on supply lines. The exposed flanks of the Bulge faced increasing pressure from both north and south.
Sepp Dietrich's formations, once spearheading an ambitious drive towards Antwerp, were now fighting to stabilize their lines. Counterattacks replaced forward thrusts. The initiative had shifted. The relief of Bastogne did more than reopen a road junction. It fractured the coherence of the German offensive. The penetration into Allied lines, once envisioned as a decisive blow, was becoming a liability, a salient vulnerable to being pinched off. Combat did not end with the breakthrough. Fighting continued into January as Allied forces widened the corridor and pushed outward. German units resisted fiercely, aware that failure here meant irreversible loss of their last strategic reserves in the west. But the momentum was gone. The timetable for reaching the Meuse River had collapsed. The dream of splitting the Allied alliance faded with each passing day. Inside Bastogne, the defenders reorganized and prepared to move from survival to counterattack. What had begun as a desperate stand had become a symbol of endurance. The crossroads town, battered and frozen, had absorbed the shock of the German assault and held long enough for relief to arrive. The sneer that Americans were merchants, not soldiers, rang hollow in the snow-covered forests. The men who endured artillery barrages, sub-zero nights, and armored assaults had proven otherwise, and the army that pivoted 90 degrees in winter and struck with precision had transformed the battle's geometry. By breaking the ring around Bastogne, the Allies did more than rescue a garrison. They cracked the spine of Hitler's final offensive in the west. The Bulge was still existing on the map. German forces still occupied deep positions in Allied territory, but from this moment forward they would be fighting not for victory, but for survival. The gamble in the Ardennes had reached its turning point.
By the final days of December 1944, the German offensive in the Ardennes had lost its driving force. What began with shock, speed, and ambition was now constrained by fuel shortages, exposed flanks, and relentless Allied counterattacks. The bulge in the Allied line remained, but it no longer expanded. It was being squeezed. After the relief of Bastogne on December 26th, the strategic initiative shifted decisively. The German timetable, reach the Meuse River within days, capture Antwerp shortly after, had collapsed. Instead of advancing west, German formations were forced to defend what they had already taken. Every kilometer gained in the early breakthrough became a liability, stretching supply lines thin across icy roads under constant air attack. The offensive had relied on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain armored momentum. That gamble failed. Many panzer units ran critically low on gasoline. Abandoned vehicles littered forest roads. Tanks that had spearheaded the assault now stood immobilized, easy targets for artillery and aircraft. The weather, which had once shielded the advance, turned against them as clear skies enabled continuous Allied airstrikes. Throughout late December and into January 1945, fighting intensified across the salient. Allied forces attacked from both north and south, gradually compressing the bulge. Units that had initially retreated regrouped and counterattacked. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery held firm in the north, while American armies pressed from multiple directions. The German High Command faced a grim reality. The offensive had consumed some of the last operational reserves of the Reich in the west: elite SS Panzer divisions, experienced crews, irreplaceable armored vehicles. Losses mounted daily. Replacement troops were scarce. Fuel production had been crippled by Allied bombing. The capacity to recover from such an expenditure no longer existed. Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, once envisioned as the hammer blow that would split the Allies, suffered heavily. Its formations, battered and depleted, could not regain their early momentum. Command disputes emerged within German leadership. Some officers urged withdrawal to more defensible positions. Others clung to the hope of stabilizing the front. but the strategic window had closed. By early January, Adolf Hitler authorized a gradual pullback. The dream of repeating the lightning victories of 1940 had dissolved into attritional retreat. The Ardennes, intended as a decisive reversal, became instead a draining struggle that Germany could not afford. The human cost was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II. American casualties exceeded 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were similarly devastating, with tens of thousands of soldiers lost and vast quantities of equipment destroyed or abandoned. For Germany, those losses were irreparable. In 26 days of intense combat, the last major offensive capability of the German army in the West was shattered. The armored spearheads that had once terrified Europe were reduced to defensive remnants. The myth of unstoppable blitzkrieg, lightning war that paralyzed opponents through speed and surprise, had been broken against logistics, resilience, and coordinated counterattack. Strategically, the consequences were decisive. When the Bulge was finally reduced by late January 1945, the Western Allies stood closer to the Rhine than ever before. German forces were weakened at the exact moment the Soviet Red Army launched its massive winter offensive in the east. The Reich was now under crushing pressure on both fronts, without reserves to shift from one crisis to another. The Ardennes amble had been Hitler's attempt to fracture Allied unity and force negotiation. Instead, it reinforced cooperation. American, British, and Allied commanders coordinated under pressure and adapted rapidly. The crisis tested their command structure, and it held. For the soldiers who endured it, the battle left indelible memories. Frozen nights in foxholes, artillery flashing across snow-covered forests, tank engines roaring through narrow roads. Bastogne became a symbol not because it was the largest engagement, but because it represented endurance under encirclement and the refusal to yield. The phrase that Americans were merely merchants, not soldiers, echoed bitterly in hindsight. The army that pivoted in 48 hours, marched through ice and fire, and broke the encirclement at Bastogne had demonstrated operational flexibility and determination at the highest level. Logistics, coordination, and industrial strength, traits once mocked, proved decisive. Blitzkrieg had depended on shock and collapse. In the Ardennes, shock was achieved, but collapse did not follow. Instead, resistance stiffened, counterattacks formed, air power returned. The deeper the German penetration, the more vulnerable it became. By February 1945, the front lines in the Ardennes had largely returned to their pre-offensive positions. The bulge on the map disappeared, but what vanished with it was far more significant: Germany's final opportunity to alter the war's trajectory in the West. From that point forward, the path led inexorably towards the Rhine, into Germany itself, and ultimately to Berlin. The Ardennes offensive did not merely fail, it accelerated the end. In the frozen forests where panzers once surged westward, burned-out vehicles and shattered trees stood silent evidence of the gamble's cost. The last reserves of the Reich had been spent. The final illusion of strategic reversal had died in snow and smoke. And the merchants had proven they were soldiers after all.